Before Israel cried out for a deliverer, before oppression darkened the land, God had given his people a beautiful inheritance. Across these hills, families lived in peace, the harvests were plentiful, and every sunrise reminded them of the Lord's faithfulness. But peace would not last forever. The people remembered the God who had brought them out of Egypt. Across the land, families gathered in gratitude. Parents taught their children his commandments, elders lifted their voices in prayer, and the smoke of offerings rose toward heaven. As long as they walked with the Lord, his peace rested upon the land. But time moves forward, and every generation must choose whom they will serve. Joshua, the faithful servant who led Israel into the Promised Land, had grown old. After a lifetime of courage and obedience, he was gathered to his fathers. And all Israel mourned the passing of the man who had trusted God without wavering. But after Joshua and the elders who knew the mighty works of the Lord had passed away, another generation arose. As the years passed, a new generation grew up. They had heard the stories of the Red Sea, of Jericho, and of God's mighty works, but they did not know the Lord for themselves. Little by little, his commandments were forgotten. The voices of worship grew quiet, and the altars of the living God were abandoned. What began as curiosity soon became compromise. The people who had once worshipped the Lord alone began to follow the gods of the nations around them. Sacred altars were abandoned, while new shrines rose upon the hills. Israel slowly forgot the one who had delivered them from Egypt. When Israel turned away from the Lord, they opened the door to the consequences of their own choices. The God who had faithfully protected Israel would not force his people to remain faithful. As they turned from him, his hand of protection was withdrawn. Beyond the eastern horizon, another kingdom was rising, and a king named Eglon saw Israel's weakness as an opportunity. The shadow of Moab was drawing near. To the east, in the kingdom of Moab, a powerful ruler watched Israel's decline. His name was Eglon. Seeing a divided and faithless nation, he forged alliances and prepared to seize the land God had given to his people. With the Ammonites and Amalekites beside him, Eglon marched westward. Across the Jordan, an army unlike anything Israel had faced in years advanced toward the City of Palms. The City of Palms fell beneath Moab's strength. Israel's defenses crumbled, and the land that had once known peace now bowed beneath a foreign king. Year after year, Israel lived beneath the rule of Moab. Their harvests were taxed, their freedom was taken, and their children grew up knowing only oppression. 18 long years passed, and many wondered if they would ever be free again. 18 years of suffering had broken Israel's pride. The people who had once forgotten the Lord now remembered his faithfulness. From every village and every home, voices rose in repentance. Once again, Israel cried out to the God who had never stopped watching over them. The Lord heard his people's cry. As he had done before, he prepared a deliverer, not a famous warrior, not a mighty king, but a man few would have noticed. His name was Ehud. Greatness is often found in ordinary acts of faithfulness. Before God entrusted Ehud with the fate of a nation, he shaped his heart through quiet service. Though few noticed him, heaven already knew his name. While others sought recognition, Ehud quietly served those in need. Strength, when guided by compassion, becomes a reflection of God's own heart. Those who are faithful in the smallest acts are often the ones God prepares for the greatest assignments. Before God entrusted him with a nation, he first met him in the quiet places. There, away from every crowd, Ehud learned that true strength begins with dependence on the Lord. The elders remembered the mighty works of God.
How long, O Lord, must we endure this?
They spoke of the nation's suffering, wondering when the Lord would once again raise a deliverer. Heaven often chooses differently than the world. While Israel searched for a warrior, God was preparing a servant. The quiet man from Benjamin would soon carry the hopes of an entire nation. God's miracles often begin with ordinary acts of obedience. Quietly and carefully, Ehud prepared for the task that lay ahead. Every strike of the hammer carried the weight of a nation's future. The weapon was simple, yet every detail mattered. A double-edged blade, crafted with care, prepared for the mission that only God fully understood. When the time came, Ehud fastened the double-edged dagger beneath his clothing on his right thigh. Hidden from every eye, he stepped forward in faith, trusting not in the blade, but in the God who had called him. As every year before, Israel gathered tribute for the king of Moab. Grain, oil, livestock, and silver were collected not as gifts, but as the painful price of 18 years of oppression. The tribute caravan set out toward the city of palms. Every step reminded Israel of their captivity. Yet among the men walked one whose heart carried a purpose known only to God. Jericho, the city of palms, once remembered for God's mighty victory, now stood beneath the banner of Moab. The land of promise had become a city under foreign rule. At the heart of the city stood the palace of King Eglon. Behind its stone walls ruled the man who had held Israel in bondage for 18 long years. Before entering the king's court, every visitor was carefully examined. Unknown to the guards, the instrument of Israel's deliverance remained hidden in plain sight. The tribute was brought before King Eglon. Israel bowed before the ruler who had oppressed them, but beneath one humble servant's cloak lay a purpose greater than any king could imagine. The tribute had been delivered. The others began their journey home. But when Ehud reached the carved idols near Gilgal, he stopped. Taking one final look toward the road behind him, he turned back alone. Leaving his companions behind, Ehud returned alone to the palace. Standing before the king once more, he spoke words that would change Israel's history forever.
I have a message for you.
Curious to hear the message, the king dismissed his attendants. The king led Ehud into his private upper room, where the cool breeze offered relief from the afternoon heat. Hidden from every eye, the moment appointed by God had arrived. Then Ehud spoke again. I have a message from God for you. At those words, the king rose from his seat, unaware that the judgment of God now stood before him. For 18 years, Israel had waited for deliverance. Every prayer, every tear, every cry for mercy had led to this single moment. In that single moment, the power that had oppressed Israel for 18 years came to an end. Without panic or haste, Ehud secured the doors of the upper chamber behind him. While the palace remained unaware, the deliverer quietly began his escape. Outside the chamber, the king's servants waited respectfully. The minutes stretched on. Still, no sound came from within. At last, they unlocked the chamber. Their king was gone, and the palace erupted in confusion. By then, the deliverer was already far beyond their reach. While confusion spread throughout the palace, Ehud had already crossed the countryside. When Ehud reached the hill country of Ephraim, he sounded the trumpet. Its echo rolled across the valleys, calling Israel to rise. Men from every tribe gathered at the sound of the trumpet. Standing upon the mountain, Ehud lifted his voice and declared, "Follow me, for the Lord has given your enemies into your hands." Led by God's wisdom, Israel moved swiftly and seized the fords of the Jordan. Before the enemy understood what had happened, every escape route had been cut off. When the Moabite soldiers attempted to cross the river, they found Israel waiting. The battle that followed would bring an end to 18 years of oppression. The strength of Moab began to fail. Their ranks broke apart, and the crossings they had hoped would save them were firmly held by Israel. The battle was won. Moab's oppression had ended, and Israel stood free once more. The people who had cried out in despair now lifted their voices in gratitude, for the Lord had delivered them through the courage of one faithful servant. When the battle was over, Israel did not boast in their own strength. They gathered together to give thanks to the Lord, for they knew that He alone had delivered them from the hand of Moab. Fields once burdened by heavy tribute flourished again. The songs of fear were replaced with songs of hope, and throughout the land, the blessings of peace began to return. Ehud did not seek riches or glory. He faithfully led Israel as judge, serving the people with wisdom, humility, and justice throughout the years of peace. Because the Lord had delivered His people, the land enjoyed peace for 80 years, the longest season of rest recorded during the time of the judges. A generation grew up knowing the blessing of God's faithfulness. One man answered God's call. One act of courageous obedience changed the course of a nation. Ehud's story reminds every generation that God often chooses ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary purposes. One man answered God's call. One act of courageous obedience changed the course of a nation. Ehud was not a king. He was not a famous warrior or celebrated leader. Yet God chose an ordinary man whose heart was willing to obey. Children were born into a land they had never seen in chains. They ran through fields of peace because one generation had chosen to trust the Lord. Around countless evening fires, parents told their children how the Lord had heard His people's cries, and how He raised a man named Ehud to bring deliverance. The story was never meant to glorify a man, but to remind every generation of God's faithfulness. Kings rise and kingdoms fall, but the Lord remains faithful forever. The God who heard Israel's cry is still the God who sees, hears, and delivers those who trust in Him. The story of Ehud was preserved in the book of Judges, not merely to remember the past, but to teach every generation that the Lord remains faithful to those who trust Him. The God who called Ehud still delights in using humble hearts. He is not searching for the strongest or the most famous, but for those who are willing to trust and obey Him. History remembers Ehud as Israel's deliverer, but heaven remembers him as a servant who simply obeyed. Every great work of God begins with one willing heart. The story of Ehud reminds us that God can use one faithful life to change the course of history. If this story encouraged your faith, share it with someone who needs hope today. And join us again as we continue bringing the greatest stories of the Bible to life.